Hello, Roland Warren here. The HBO show called Last Week Tonight with John Oliver just aired a segment on crisis pregnancy centers. A producer from the show reached out to us at CareNet for some background information. Unfortunately, it does not appear that they used any of what we sent them, but I'll get back to that in a moment. As usual, the segment relied on some debunked misinformation about pregnancy centers that has been circulating for years. The basic premise of Oliver's diatribe is that abortion is such an important topic that there are certain standards that should be met when talking to women about it, and that pregnancy centers fail to meet those standards. The irony of this segment is that it failed its own test miserably. The 4 pillars of Oliver's test for how to talk appropriately about abortion are: you should not use generalizations, you should provide sources for all your data, you should not be misleading in coverage of the topic, and you should not make light of the serious aspects of abortion, such as the medical procedures associated with it. Well, guess what? Oliver committed all of those no-nos in a segment whose purpose was to tell you how bad those no-nos are. In terms of using generalizations, the segment used video clips from previously released news reports and documentaries, most of which were many years old, to make general statements about all pregnancy centers today. In other words, if one pregnancy center did something many years ago, Oliver implied that most pregnancy centers do the same thing today. According to Oliver's own data, there are 2,752 pregnancy centers in the United States today. How is using an example of what one of those centers did many years ago representative of how all centers operate today? And that leads to the second standard that Oliver violated: providing sources for all the data. He gave examples of statements pregnancy centers made and then attempted to debunk them by calling them BS. Why didn't he simply cite a study to show that what the center said was wrong rather than resorting to vulgarity? For example, he says that abortion is far less medically dangerous than carrying a child to term. This statement has been debunked so many times, it's hard to believe we have to continue to debunk it. This misleading statement relies on comparing the maternal mortality rate and the abortion mortality rate, which, according to the CDC, are measures that are conceptually different and are used by the CDC for different health purposes. So, Oliver simply made a claim and provided no evidence to support it, a practice he says makes pregnancy centers so terrible. And this leads to the third of his own rules he violates. He said that pregnancy centers mislead women with false or incomplete information. He mentions a data point about how abortion doubles the risk of breast cancer, calls it BS, but then doesn't explain why it's BS. Because what he doesn't want to tell you is that there are more than 108 worldwide scientific studies published on abortion and breast cancer, none of which are in pro-life publications, but are unbiased medical studies published in peer-reviewed journals. Now, of those 108 studies, 79 of them found an increased risk between induced abortion and the later development of breast cancer. Research conducted in other countries has overwhelmingly supported the claim that abortion is a risk for breast cancer. 10 out of 10 studies conducted in India, 30 out of 37 studies conducted in China, 5 out of 6 in France, and 4 out of 4 in Japan. In 2014, a meta-analysis published in the international journal Cancer Causes and Control reached a similar conclusion. The analysis examined 36 studies in China where, because of the one-child policy, there is a high abortion rate and a very large sample population. The study found a 44% average increased risk of breast cancer among women with abortion histories. The risk increased to 76% for those with 2 abortions and 79% for those with 3. Because of the strong pro-choice lobby in the United States, data like this doesn't get much exposure. There is not an American-style abortion debate in China. They're looking at this data as more of a public health concern. In other words, Oliver does exactly what he thinks is so bad about pregnancy centers. He cherry-picks data to prove a point he wants to make, provides no evidence to support it, and then fails to mention evidence that contradicts his viewpoint. Finally, here's the biggest irony of Oliver's segment. He implies that abortion is such an important topic that one should not make light of it. The segment makes fun of pregnancy centers that refers to the provision of free ultrasounds winsomely as jelly on the belly. He calls it childish and says he wouldn't trust a doctor who made light of a medical procedure in this way. But then, mere minutes later, he says that pregnancy centers should be giving out birth control in Pez dispensers, passing out condoms to trick-or-treaters, and giving IUD earrings as hostess gifts. Wait a second. I thought we should not be making light of an important medical topic. But what all this boils down to is that folks like John Oliver have already made up their minds about abortion and pregnancy centers, and they don't care what the truth is. Like I said, a producer for the show reached out to us and asked us for information. We sent them information, and they ignored it. We sent them the Truth About Crisis Pregnancy Center report, which addresses all of the common misconceptions that Oliver based his segment on. But the show still failed to tell the whole story. We sent them videos of women sharing their difficult abortion experiences and their positive pregnancy center experiences. They used none of that footage. For example, if everything Oliver said is true, then the nature of pregnancy centers would be reflected in actual client experiences with centers. We sent the producer the data that shows that from 2014 to 2016, 97% of clients at CareNet-affiliated pregnancy centers who answered an exit survey reported that they had a positive experience at the center. Why didn't Oliver mention this data? Moreover, if centers were such terrible places, then wouldn't it be reflected in negative reviews in places like Yelp and Google? Proof that those negative reviews don't exist is that the pro-choice organization Lady Parts Justice League recently created an entire campaign encouraging people to go online and post fake negative reviews of pregnancy centers. Why would they have to do this if real negative reviews already existed? Look, John Oliver is certainly free to critique pregnancy centers, but according to his own standards, he should seriously consider doing the same to the abortion industry. He claims that pregnancy centers are limiting women's choices through their deceptive practices. But according to its own most recent annual report, Planned Parenthood, the nation's largest provider of abortions, performs 41 abortions for every instance of prenatal services and 83 abortions for every adoption referral. Planned Parenthood was also recently exposed for selling the body parts of aborted fetuses. There is video galore, congressional testimony, and other sources to pull from to tell a compelling story. I find it hard to believe that Last Week Tonight can't find a story in there somewhere. Planned Parenthood literally has a vested interest in making sure that a woman's only choice is abortion. That's where they make money. CareNet-affiliated pregnancy centers provide all their services completely free of charge. We have no financial interest in any one choice over another. And even if a woman decides to abort, we will love her and support her nonetheless, even offering post-abortion care. In fact, our centers have provided over $113 million in free medical, educational, material, and other services to women and families in the last 2 years alone. We sent John Oliver's show this data, and they ignored it. Perhaps the reason they ignored our information is because telling the truth about pregnancy centers exposes a very real problem with the abortion industry. Pregnancy centers show us the compassionate care that the abortion clinics do not and will not provide. And that is a fact that HBO doesn't want women to know. Until next time, may God bless you daily as you serve Him faithfully.